For 2 days, Incheon had been bombed by aircraft dropping napalm on the North Korean defenses and pounded by warships. Now, under yet more covering fire, the landing craft used the high tide to sweep in from the sea and land on Wolmi-do's green beach. Through the chaos caused by the supporting fire, wave after wave of landing craft headed for Green Beach.
Smoke was boiling out of Incheon. The entire beach area simply disappeared in an enormous cloud of dust and smoke, with only the occasional glare of rocket bursts showing through. It was just awesome.
But as the first wave of Marines approached Green Beach, they were faced with a daunting task. Scaling the 12-foot-high defensive seawalls under enemy fire.
Well, this is Green Beach on Wolmi-do today. Not quite the same sight that would have greeted the first wave of US Marines as they clambered up the sea wall. With the second wave of Marines just 4 minutes behind, they quickly advanced inland, the landscape blackened and blasted by the covering fire. The Marines swept over the island, meeting limited resistance and suffering few casualties. In just 2 hours, the Marines' commander radioed the waiting fleet. Wolmi-do secured. Phase 1 of their mission had been accomplished. As this tide retreated, it took with it the landing craft, their vital lifeline to the Allied ships out there. They had to dig in. For the next 12 hours, they had the unenviable task of defending the island against a possible counterattack. It was vital the Marines held their ground. Only if they retained control of this crucial island could further waves of landing craft move safely onto Incheon itself. They waited hour after hour for the tide to turn, waiting to defend against any North Korean counterattack. But the big attack never came. Only at 5:30 did the tide come back in, and conditions were again favorable for the next phase of the American landings further up the channel. Red Beach fell to the Marines with little resistance. But there was still one more beach to capture. Almost simultaneously, the Marines assaulted here at Blue Beach, about a mile south of Incheon. But things on Blue Beach didn't go quite as smoothly. Out to sea, 25 separate assault waves had formed, but as they approached the shore, many of them were swept wildly off course by the strong currents. The assault on Blue Beach was in disarray, landing craft at risk of capsizing, men in danger of drowning. Those who did make it through found the beach choked with smoke from the earlier naval bombardment.
The actual landing conditions were terrible. The city was on fire, and the rain was mixing with the smoke and fire of the bombardment, so it was very difficult finding the beach. Some units got mixed up, landing on the wrong beaches, and we just had to get it all sorted out.
Despite the problems, there was no serious opposition to stop the Allied advance. They managed to push on through Incheon and further inland. Their journey took them eastwards, liberating village after village, rapidly crushing what little North Korean resistance they met. Their bold attack behind enemy lines had been a resounding success. In just 11 days, the men of the United Nations Army had reached their target and recaptured the South Korean capital, Seoul. The war in Korea was taking a whole new turn.
By now, the Allied forces pinned down inside the Pusan perimeter had been reinforced with fresh battle-ready troops. They broke out and thrust north to join those who'd recaptured Seoul. The United Nations forces could now attack the North Korean troops from two directions. Kim Il-sung's army was effectively surrounded and quickly collapsed. Within just 2 weeks, the Allies had pushed the crumbling North Korean army back over the 38th parallel, back into North Korea. The United Nations could have ended the war right there, but MacArthur wanted to press on. He didn't just want to kick communism out of South Korea, but crush it in North Korea as well. He said the North should pay the penalty for invading the South. He urged the United Nations to take the war across the border. At the end of September 1950, MacArthur got his way. He was given the go-ahead to cross the 38th parallel and push into North Korea. The UN army were no longer repelling an invasion. They had themselves become the invaders. The Allied invasion of North Korea began very well. On October the 7th, the main body of the United Nations force drove northwards, and within a month they'd overrun the communist capital, Pyongyang. Still they pressed on, scattering any North Koreans who opposed them. The United Nations forces were now within reach of fulfilling MacArthur's vision of a total victory over communism and a united anti-communist Korea. But every step his men took north threatened to awaken a sleeping dragon. MacArthur's troops were now fast approaching the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and Communist China. The Chinese leader, Mao Zedong, had been watching events in Korea. His new communist regime was only a year old and far from secure. Now the United Nations Army was rapidly approaching his eastern border. As far as Mao was concerned, this was blatant imperialist aggression, and it had to be stopped. In September 1950, he ordered the Chinese People's Volunteer Army into North Korea. Led by Commander Peng Dehuai, their aim was to confront and crush the United Nations. The vast armies of China had joined the war.
Almost overnight, the men of the United Nations faced a very different enemy. The Chinese were tough, They were battle-hardened veterans of years of civil war, expert in close-quarters fighting and used to the rugged terrain. What really set them apart as a fighting force is that they were highly politicized. Each man had to sign a pledge of commitment to the cause, and each unit had to swear an oath to destroy imperialism.
They warned us if we didn't wipe out the enemy in Korea now, one day they would come back to China and we would lose everything. We swore to triumph in the communist cause and protect everything the revolution had won for us. We weren't ever going to be oppressed by imperialists again.
The Chinese may have been rugged and determined, but their real advantage lay in the sheer vastness of their numbers. The UN, on the other hand, relied on completely different strategies. Rather than the massed use of troops travelling swiftly and silently across open countryside, the UN had fewer troops, relying on road-bound tanks and artillery. But no matter how lethal the artillery fire, it did little to stem the massed attacks of the Chinese army.
We swarmed into action like ants. The enemy guns overheated with the continuous use. They began to misfire and could no longer hit their targets. In the end, they would see so many people coming at them, they would panic.
One after another, United Nations positions were simply overwhelmed by wave after wave of Chinese infantry. Some United Nations units fought hard. Others fell back in disarray. Generally, morale collapsed, and to make matters worse, the bitter Korean winter was setting in. By late November 1950, with the temperature well below 0 degrees, men of both sides were fighting at the limit of human endurance. The Chinese soldiers were wearing only lightly padded cotton uniforms and thin canvas shoes to protect them against the bitter cold. The Allies fared little better, and much of their equipment simply seized up. The men had to keep themselves awake for fear of freezing to death as they slept.
The first night the Chinese hit us, I lost 39 men to frostbite. The next afternoon, I went down to the medical station, and the doctors were breaking off all those frozen toes with forceps. I never saw those men again. I lost a whole platoon to frostbite.
Fighting a war in these dire conditions was not what these men had expected. To make matters worse, some American Marines found themselves surrounded at a place called Choi Sin. Despite relentless Chinese attacks, the Americans managed to fight their way out. But elsewhere on the battlefield, other soldiers couldn't cope. Without waiting for orders, some turned around and fled.
We moved headlong, helter-skelter, trying to get to the port at Busan. It was disgusting. Unbelievable. I never felt so ashamed in all of my life as to be a part of an army that was running away.
Allied defenses were crumbling across practically the entire front line. The United Nations generals had no choice. They ordered a full-scale withdrawal. It was the largest military withdrawal in US history. As the Chinese drove south, the United Nations Army folded in front of them. And by January 1951, the Americans and their allies had been thrown back south of Seoul. Once again, the South Korean capital was in the hands of the communists. But this proved a step too far. Because the Chinese had moved so far south, their supply lines were now severely strained, and the tide turned yet again. The UN army once more began to push north. Over the first weeks of 1951, the Allies clawed their way back to a line just north of Seoul, but just south of the old border. After 7 months of seesawing, advance and withdrawal, once more, the two sides were practically back to where they'd been when the war began. The huge, sweeping moves of the two sides up and down the peninsula subsided into an apparent stalemate. But how to break this stalemate was to lead to a crisis at the very highest level of the American leadership. But General MacArthur still demanded total victory over his communist enemy. MacArthur believed his president's policy was too timid, and he was going to say so loud and clear. In order to achieve total victory, he demanded that the war should be taken into China itself. What MacArthur was proposing was not simply to attack China, but to have the option of attacking it with nuclear weapons. This war was threatening to go nuclear.